The US federal budget is frankly on what I'll call an unsustainable path, but it's not for the reasons that most people think. Welcome to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also a managing director and partner here at One Capital Management. I'm here each and every week to help you navigate your financial journey because after all, your money matters. Today on the show, we're gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about something I haven't really covered in the last 40 plus episodes that we've done. I wanna talk about the budget deficit. So here at One Capital Management, we've been having conversations around the federal rate hikes, and I'll be talking about that more later as we get into that data. And we've seen the news sources around the budget deficit, and I wanna hit this on the head with some facts today. But before we do, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get into it. You know, this budget deficit is kind of this whole debt thing, right? We've been talking about it for years and years, and we know where our debt is. And I want to talk about a few of those facts and how it relates to our administrations, by the way, both Republicans and Democrats, and then how it relates to us on Main Street, we'll call it. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a bold statement here. The US federal budget is frankly on what I'll call an unsustainable path, but it's not for the reasons that most people think. Yes, our national debt is around 31 trillion or so, which is well higher than the annual GDP and frankly only going up. And yes, the budget deficit last year was more than 1 trillion for the third year in a row. And look, none of this is good, but the real root isn't the debt or the deficits, it's government overspending. Now, I want to stop and pause for a second there. I think it's important to know that this isn't a complaining session. This is just a natural American statement here as also an advisor for nearly 20 years, just looking at overspending just in general across both parties and across different situations that we've seen politically in our world and really in our domestic environment. And again, this is not a political show, but the reality is what comes out of DC has a lot to do with what we'll call the sandbox to which all of us, United States, the investors, our advisors, frankly, for all listening and watching investors in this world have to deal with. Look, if the government had an enormous debt, but spent very little, the private sector could actually probably produce the country's way out of the debt problem. It's the same way you and I would manage debt. If our debt is fixed and we kick the spending issue, we can treat that issue, right? It's the symptom versus the disease. You know what I mean? Like we see the symptoms being the debt, but the disease is more important because that's the overspending, right? We do it in our own personal lives all the time and we can cure this. So if the government had an enormous debt, but spent little, the private sector would probably be fine. We would get out of the debt problem. And if the US had little debt, we could still have, by the way, economic problems from too much government spending. So it goes both ways. So the whole impetus here is government spending. Now I'll tie this into how we look at the world nowadays with investing and using this as a framework. Now, but before I go that way, ultimately, the government funds itself by what? By borrowing or taxing the wealth produced by private industry. We know this isn't shocking to anybody. And right now, we have a commander-in-chief, and like many commanders-in-chief, not just him, they've been in politics basically their entire career. If they've never had a private sector job or they've been in politics so long, they almost forget what it's like to have a private sector job, to feel like you can get fired, to feel like you still have to manage your own personal savings, your personal income, and investments. But our government funds itself by borrowing or taxing the wealth created by you and I in private industry in general. Now, if spending were high and borrowing was low, taxes would have to be prohibitively high, right? I mean, the bottom line is that excessive spending leads to economic ills for the most part. Now, I may be going through something that you probably and likely already know, but I want to go through the why. And a lot of this write-up today was actually on an excerpt I was reading from Brian Westbury, who's a chief economist for a company called First Trust, something that I followed him since college years before even First Trust. So I just like the way he wrote this. And so a lot of this is credit to him and his team around this. And I was doing some research myself with regards to what I've been talking with clients about, frankly, about the budget deficit and is there something to be concerned about there and where do we need to be going with this? But talking about the why is really important. What's going on in Congress and the deficit is so important. Now, real quickly, according to the Congressional Budget Office, or what we likely know as a CBO, spending on entitlements, which are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other healthcare programs, will rise from about 10.7% of gross domestic production to 15.1% over the next 30 years. Meanwhile, mind you, the net interest on the national debt will almost certainly be higher than when it was last year, unless and until we bring the deficit down and slow the growth of the debt in general. This is why, in my opinion, the debt limit debate now going on in Washington, D.C. is so important. Don't fall for the false narrative or that one group of politicians on either side who wants to push the country into default. Depending on what news channel you're going to watch, you might find that there's going to be political rants between, again, the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, and vice versa. And I don't want anyone to fall for the false narrative that there's literally one group out there that's trying to push the country into default, nor should anyone want to abolish the debt ceiling altogether. There are two narratives that I've seen out there that are kind of, I think, misplayed in terms of the media. If there's a way to shine some light, look, this is what I want to say. If there's a way to shine some light on overspending, in my opinion, why shouldn't it be used if the debt ceiling politics can focus attention on fiscal issues? That's, again, from a fiscal person, been doing this for 2 decades now. This is what I love what Brian wrote, right? I feel it's done its job if it shines a light on fiscal issues. So many of us right now who are, for lack of a better term, downplaying what's going on in DC in this whole, what seems like a marketing campaign, it actually can shed light on overspending, which I think is really a great thing. And let's let that happen. If the debt ceiling politics, let's call it that, can focus on the fiscal issues, it's done its job. What we expect and what I think many economists expect is a last minute budget deal like what we'll see. And we've seen it before. And that includes either caps on discretionary spending for future years, maybe some sort of commission or committee that can make proposals to reform entitlements, which, by the way, with expedited procedural rules, so the proposals get a congressional vote. And I'll digress on that. But there's many things out there discussing that, or maybe both, as part of a bipartisan deal to raise the debt ceiling. But let's for a second go down the highly unlikely path that the debt limit is not raised. I think for many of us thinking about that, it's like, well, what happens then? Look, the Treasury Department would still, if you look at the numbers, would still likely have enough cash flow to pay all the securitized debt as it comes due, as well as the entitlements, again, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So for a first moment here in time, and looking at the numbers currently as we see them, and as I've read from some of the economists writing some of this data points, and for any client or any listener or viewer out there thinking like, okay, what if we don't? What if this doesn't happen? We still can pay our stuff, basically, is what I want to share. And that's something I want to hit on the head right now. It is true, though, that other programs and agencies would have to take substantial cuts to make sure that those, what we would consider higher priority payments get made. And yes, our current administration will not enjoy making that choice for obvious political reasons. By the way, any administration would not love those choices, but it's still a choice that they alone get to make. Now, here's the thing. Ultimately, investors and frankly, voters need to realize that not every national debt is the same. I want to reiterate that. Not every national debt is the same, even if they're the same amount. Let's go back in history for a second. The US, from a fiscal standpoint, had a debt problem after the Revolutionary War, which was a small price to pay, I think, we would almost all agree, for starting an independent country. We also had a debt problem after World War II, but that was the price we paid to win a crucial war and frankly fight evil. Now, our current debt problem is not like those. I think politicians spend money to win favor with their constituents. Agreed? It's okay. It's not wrong to use, but I would love your opinions on this, so you can leave some comments down below. It's not wrong to use the debt ceiling as a way to focus attention on this problem and the endemic overspending that it creates. That's a habit. This debt limit debate needs to break again if there's a way to shine light, again, specifically shining light on the overspending. Hopefully we're getting some people out there talking about it and saying, look, we can raise the debt limit, that's fine, but let's stop the overspending. No different than how I talk with clients. I've been doing it for 2 decades around cash flow management, debt management, whether it's buying a home, putting a kid through college, paying down credit card debts from an emergency, whatever it might be. We do this in our own lives. And all we're asking, I guess what I'm trying to say today when we talk about the debt debate and the debt limit, and everyone wants to get in the camp of like, we're taking on too much debt. I'm not disagreeing with that by any means. But it's really what I want to share is these are good things to have if it shines light on the overspending. No different than when if you were to sit with an advisor who's helping you and earnest with you around, really helping you get out of debt or helping you understand why getting out of debt is truly vital to the success of your overall investment, financial, and retirement plan. I want to make a bridge here for how that relates to investments and how that relates to what we're seeing here in the market. And I want to talk about specifically 5 factors that impact stock prices. So it's important to note on this show, on the Make Your Money Matter show, the idea with taking topical ideas with what's going on, what we've been seeing over the past month or so, and anytime you're looking at news channels and things like that, we want to make sure as advisors, we are unbiased and really focus on your well-being. And so when anyone's really talking about right now some issue with the debt limit or government overspending, which again, highlighting government overspending in particular, just like we would in our own household. If we're overspending, that's a fiscal problem, right? But when we get rid of the fiscal problem, I want to shift focuses here for a second on fundamental investing. And many of you, I focus on that, which is looking at the value of a company and what it will create for our clients and for ultimately the returns that we are needing for each of our clients and their goals and their objectives. And there's 5 that I wanted to bring up today on the show that I think are important. Now, there's obviously, we'll do some ensuing shows and topics around specifics of some of these, but the 5 general terms I like, the 5 categories, if you will, are important here. Number 1, I think, is financial reports. So things like revenue, income, earnings per share, expectations, whether the latest financial reports are good or bad. Really, you can see these influence the stock price of a company. Not always what's going on in DC is my first bridge here, right? We have things of political regulations, different administrations, whatever it might be, and it's giving us the sandbox that all these CEOs of companies have to play in. And therefore, one of the ways to value a company, whether it's an administration, during a debt limit discussion conversation, a recession, or an inflation, whatever time period, these 5 help. So the first one's a financial report. Again, it shows a lot what's going on. We see this typically in the first part of a quarter because we get last quarter's numbers, last quarter's reviews. So that's an interesting note. So financial reports is number 1. Number 2, let's call it personnel changes. Maybe the appointment of a new CEO or maybe the swift resignation of a top official, can influence the stock price of a company really for varying different reasons. Now, mind you, we're also seeing some cutbacks in our economy. So you're going to see some of those things happen as well, especially in the tech sector. There was an abundance of jobs created through the pandemic, and we're really seeing those kind of move off, which is to be seen whether or not that's going to be efficient or effective for the company. And that's something we have to study fundamentally. We're also seeing future growth coming down a little bit, although for the most part, still positive. And companies are doing what I think, again, is fiscally responsible. It doesn't look great in the media, letting go of CEOs or letting go of executives or even employees, but it's fiscally responsible to make sure that they're minding what's going on. And a big part of what's going on for most companies is cost of labor, and basically salaries for people. So that's interesting to note. Personnel changes. Number 3, dividend changes, especially with value companies, right? One of the big differentiators, there's a couple of them, but growth versus value is a value company will typically have a dividend. So this is especially important for value companies. So the increase, as an example of a dividend or the cutting of a dividend can cause a stock price to change. So understanding how those look matter. Quick aside, this is something that if you're working with an advisor, they should be doing for you. It's what we here at One Capital Management do for our clients. So I want to bring that up as, we look at it fundamentally. There's a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, and this is more of a top-down, right? Obviously, that plays into more of the sector industries in the company. This is more the general terms of things to look at when you value a company. The 4th one I'll bring up, I will call it business announcements. So let's say the announcement of a new product or service, or maybe the acquisition or merger of another company can either increase or decrease depending on the company you're looking at the share price of that company. I think one of the best examples of this was Apple. I mean, they basically created the marketplace for big business announcements, right? They created a whole hoopla around it. And we all saw that, with the iPhone in particular, some odd 15 years ago. Now, mind you, business announcements have been going on since the start of the market. I mean, there's always some product, service, or acquisition going on. So keeping pace on, what that looks like for your portfolio and how we look at it as investment managers for our clients matters a lot. And the 5th and final one I'll bring up is sentiment changes. We've heard the term consumer sentiment before. And what does that really mean? The market, if you will, the proverbial market is made up of what? It's made up of you and me. We're human beings. We are collectively the market, and we have emotions and we have sentiments. And when consumer sentiment is low, there's not exactly a huge confidence that tomorrow is going to be a brighter day. So consumer sentiment changes factors into industries and into sectors and ultimately into companies. I mean, positive news, as an example, or hype around a company can propel the stock higher, and the same as a negative press can cause the prices to fall. So I wanted to share these 5 because I wanted to look, at what we're seeing as a deficit discussion or a budget deal, if you will, from the government, and really how we want to relate it to what we're seeing in our portfolio and companies. Now, of all those things I mentioned, some of it's fundamental investing and some of it's a little technical or a little bit just kind of seeing the ebbs and flows of the market, mainly the consumer sentiment one, right? There's nothing fundamental really going on with the company so much as it is kind of the feelings we all have about that company or about that industry. And some of that comes from the feelings we get because of things that are coming out of DC or the things that we're hearing on the news. So, it's really an important thing to kind of understand those 5 things as we kind of share that with news. Anytime there's news in DC or in Congress around debates or discussions, especially with different administrations. And, if we can curtail the spending, the overspending, we're not going to have too much of a deficit issue. And if you can imagine for a second, no matter what side you're on here, you got 2 screens in front of you, right? One is, C-SPAN and you're watching the budget deficit conversation and your blood's boiling or you're thinking about it. And then on the other screen, maybe you have your brokerage account up, right? Remember, they don't necessarily directly correlate. And I think I need to share that with everybody because I think sometimes, whether it's C-SPAN or CNN or Fox or whatever news outlet, and no knock to any one of those, right? But we directly relate it to now our brokerage statement on a custodial or an advisor side. And yes, there's a lot that interplays there, but it's not exactly directly correlated. So on the one hand, I'm talking about some of the items that I want to see happen with this deficit conversation, let alone the debt ceiling being raised. But the fact of the matter is, I love it because it's shedding light, I think, hopefully, on the overspending. By the way, you and I, again, would do this for our own household, right? So a lot of times we can relate the deficit to how we would manage our own household. And that's the problem I've always had about typical government officials, is simply because if you haven't had a private sector job or you're just so far removed from it, you have no idea that when you say you want to spend something and you really have no idea, how you're going to pay for that, that's a big problem. We wouldn't do that in our household, and we're just asking that of our politicians, of who we elected. And we all deal with this as everyday Americans. And so all we hope for, regardless of the administration, is that we do it right and we do it well. And I want to leave you with this today. The financial position you are in today is based on the financial choices you made in the past. But the financial position you'll be in say, 2030 will be based on the financial choices you make today. It's what we do today that will affect us down the road. Any decisions that we make, big or small, have ripple effects for many years to come. Okay, it's time to answer your questions. If you have a question or topic you'd like me to address, you can leave it a comment or a question in the comment section, or if it's something a bit more one-on-one you'd like to discuss, just go to the About page on this channel. You can send us an email. We'll always keep the questions I read here anonymous. You don't have to worry about your name being shared, but we would love to hear from you. So the question that came in today, I actually kind of liked because although it has little to do with the conversation we had about the deficit, it also has a lot to do with it because we're talking about debt. And it was the question around credit score and, and why is that important and how do we use that correctly? And I get the question a lot, like, how do you increase your credit score? How do you keep your credit score high? There's 2 things that I always share. And again, we don't necessarily get directly into the consumer credit environment so much, but I do know this, that there's 2 main factors. One is paying them on time, every time, no late payments, nothing like that. And then the other one is utilization, meaning the amount that you use per credit limit that you have. So, if you keep those in check, you likely will raise your credit score or keep your credit score high. But I also think it's important to note this, like one of the things that's really empowering for a lot of people is you need your credit score less if you pay down your debt more, right? So the reality is you don't need your credit if you really aren't taking on any debt. Now I know it's like, great, Brad, I get that. But like I have, kids again to put through college. I got, my daughter's turning 16. I just dealt with that with a client. I got to help her get a car. So I got to co-sign. They're going to pull credit, right? Whether soft or hard checks, they're going to pull it, right? So it still does matter. I get that. But you tend to worry less about it if you start managing your overspending, hopefully like what our government's hopefully going to do, right? If you start managing overspending, fix the disease. Again, wrong way to say it, but it's important. It's a good analogy, right? The symptom is the debt. The disease is the overspending, right? So if we fix that, the credit score will naturally follow just because you're not putting more on it, meaning your utilization's going down and you're still making the payment along the way. Maybe doing a snowball effect or an avalanche method of paying down your debt, whatever that might be. So thank you for the question. It's a good one. I chose that one because it had still to do with debt, and we're talking about, debt limit and debate conversations in Congress right now. So appreciate the question. And again, if you have a question or comment you'd like me to read here, you can leave it in the comments section, or again, email us in the About page on our channel. Before we go, if you found anything helpful today and want to learn more, you can visit our website at onecapital.com. You can also scan the QR code on the screen with your smartphone. It'll get you right there. You can also call or text us. We want to help. Listen, there's no pressure here. We don't treat people like a number. In fact, we value our relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. And if you're not following us on social media, you should be. You can follow us at Make Your Money Matter. We're sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. And as I often say, if you enjoy the show, share with someone you like. I guess if you don't like the show, share with someone you don't like. But until next week, always remember, make your money matter.